Into the early hours of Saturday morning, and the Constitution Alteration Bill is expected to pass soon. We know that this bill essentially triggers the timeline for the referendum to be held, so the government can nominate a date no sooner than 2 months and no later than 6 months from today. This legislation also outlines what will change in the Constitution if the referendum is successful, which we know has been the subject of a lot of debate over recent months. But with this bill passing, that will essentially be set.
We'll leave Norheda there because what she's talking about is actually happening in the Senate. Let's take a listen.
The third reading of the Constitution Alteration Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice Bill 2023. And in making my contribution, I want to make it very clear to the chamber what will happen on this side when this bill is voted on today. The majority of this side of the chamber will vote to pass this bill through the parliament. This is not, though, because we agree with what this bill ultimately sets out to achieve, which is, of course, to irrevocably change this nation's constitution in a way that will destroy one of our most fundamental values, equality of citizenship. The majority of us will vote to pass this bill because we believe in the people of this nation and their right to have a say on this issue. Ironically, the referendum, of course, will provide an equal say for every citizen. What we tried to do through the committee process on Friday evening and into Saturday morning was to establish some basic information for the Australian people. Some basic information so that when they ultimately vote in this referendum, they could be properly informed. What we saw, however, from this government was a cynical exercise to obfuscate and deflect, rather than provide the Australian people with the answers they both want and they deserve. Senator Watt, of course, was armed with his handy little booklet that he purported gave Australians the information that they need. But he wasn't armed with the answer to the real questions Australians are concerned about. On more than 100 occasions, the best Senator Watt could do on behalf of the government was this response: well, that will be a matter for the parliament, or alternatively, I refer to my previous answer. It was without a doubt one of the greatest displays of an exercise in avoiding giving the Australian people the details that I said. Not only do they want, but if you were treating them with any form of respect, you would ensure as a government you were able to give it to them. But despite this government's inability to answer any questions on how the voice will work, some things were established during the committee process. We showed that there are genuine legal risks that the Australian people are just being asked to accept. We showed that the only real attempt at explaining the voice is a glossy 2-page brochure that what we also found out isn't even worth the paper it's written on. Australia's Constitution is our most important legal document. Every single word can be open to interpretation. The meaning of the words in the chapeau, the meaning of the words in section 129(1), the meaning of the words in section 129(2), and the meaning of the words in section 129(3) are all important issues, and not one of them was explained during the committee process. What we do know, though, from our interrogation of the bill, is that it is 4 things. It's risky, it's unknown, it's divisive, and on top of all of that, when you change our constitution, it is a permanent change. Enshrining the voice in the Constitution does mean that it's open to legal challenge. And if it is open to legal challenge, it is open for interpretation by the High Court of Australia. Ultimately, despite what the government says, it is the High Court of Australia who will determine what the right to make representations actually means, a vital question that we did pursue in the committee stage and there is still no adequate answers to. What we do know is that legal experts don't agree. And the legal experts, I'm sure, cannot be sure how any High Court will interpret such a constitutional change. Again, what are we doing here? We are opening up a legal can of worms. The proposed model, as we know it, is not just to the Parliament. It's to all areas of executive government. It gives an unlimited scope, as we've heard, from the Reserve Bank potentially to Centrelink, or in the words of a constitutional law professor, from submarines to parking tickets. And what does then that mean for the Australian people and for the government that they know? Well, there is a considerable risk of delay to government decision-making. And what does this ultimately deliver to them potentially? The risk of dysfunctional government. There is no doubt that every single one of us in this place wants to see better outcomes for the most marginalised people in our community. We all want to lift them up. None of us want to put barriers in their way. But in our national anthem, we now proudly sing that we are one and free. And what the Albanese government is proposing with the Voice is a way of dividing us, and that certainly does not make us one. As Senator Nampijinpa Price has said, we should be one together, not two divided. And as Ian Callanan AC Casey, former High Court judge, has said, I would foresee a decade or more of constitutional and administrative law litigation arising out of the Voice. The Coalition does not believe that this is what the Australian people want. Once the Voice is in the Constitution, it won't be undone. Once the High Court makes an interpretation, Parliament can't overrule it. We'll be stuck with the negative consequences and bad outcomes. And what we saw in the committee stage of the bill on Friday night and into Saturday morning is that the government either will not tell or, even worse, is unable to tell Australians the most basic details. The government did not have the answers. The big message out of all of this, the Voice, is four things. It's risky, it's unknown, it's divisive and it's permanent. If you don't know how the Voice is going to work, my humble opinion is vote no.
Senator Cox.
Thank you, President. And what a truly historic day for First Peoples and, in fact, for all of us. Can I start by acknowledging all of the First Nations people and others gathered here today in the gallery. We have a new generation of people voting in their first referendum, and for the first time, some of them, it'll be actually their first time ever voting. And what a first vote to have. Eligible Australians will be voting to recognise First Peoples of this country in the nation's birth certificate. We are the oldest living culture in the world. We have cared for this country, preserved the waters and ecosystems. We were the first inventors and are navigated by the stars for tens of thousands of years. We are hundreds of nations across this country with different stories, languages, cultures, arts and dance. Our people have provided many Australian governments with beautiful, deliberate and considered words in the form of statements, declarations and agreements. Now, what we need is action. That is the responsibility of all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, from remote communities to the decision-makers here in this place. And we must stand together in solidarity. In passing this bill today, the Senate triggers a referendum and signals that the Parliament's work is done. It is time for the grassroots Yes campaigners to get out there in the community and share with all Australians why this referendum is so important and why a voice to Parliament is so important. But this is only the beginning of what is needed, and we need to restore First Nations people's rights in this country. We also need progress towards truth and treaty, and we need that also now. We need to see progress on closing the gap, community-based healthcare, education in language, stronger cultural heritage protections and better legal frameworks to be provided for consultation on projects that are happening on country and in land or sea country. For over 200 years since colonisation, we have been fighting to survive. The frontier wars saw our people chained and massacred on our lands and being systemically stolen. Government policy ripped our children from our families and punished them for speaking our languages and practising our law and our cultural traditions. And today, we continue to fight governments and fossil fuel billionaires who are destroying our sacred places, our meeting places for ceremony and cultural business, our ancestral songlines and our trade routes, which are in fact the social and spiritual fabric of our culture. We are sovereign people, sovereign nations, and the Commonwealth Government— I'm sorry, do you have a contribution, Senator Thorpe? President?
Order. Senator
Happy
Thorpe,
to sit and let her—
your interjection is disorderly. I'm asking you to listen in silence. Senator Cox, please continue.
Thank you. We are sovereign people, sovereign nations, and the Commonwealth Government must treat us as such. I'm sorry, President. Senator Thorpe continues to be disorderly by her interjections. With respect—
Thank you, Senator Cox. Senator Thorpe, I have asked you to listen in silence. We're up to the third reading. If you want to make a contribution, you may stand to do so. Otherwise, I'm asking you to listen in silence. Please continue, Senator Cox.
Our sovereignty has in fact never been ceded. My sovereignty is my birthright to care for this country, to protect this country, and to be a knowledge holder and to pass those traditional knowledges on to the next generation. This change in the Constitution does not impact our sovereignty, my sovereignty. I would not be standing—
Order.
I'm happy to let Senator Thorpe continue my
Senator
speech if you like.
Cox, allow me to control the chamber. Senator Thorpe, I have called you to order a number of times. I don't want to be constantly interrupting Senator Cox. I have asked you to listen in silence. I expect that to happen. Senator Cox, please continue.
This change to the Constitution does not impact our sovereignty, my sovereignty. And I would not be standing up here in support of this bill if I had any doubt in my mind that it would. Greens have sought independent legal advice. We have had discussions with the Referendum Working Group, the Attorney-General, and the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, who joins us here today, and many others. And I want to thank them for their respect of our concerns and for taking the time to hear us and address these concerns. Ceding our sovereignty is something that I, and I assume all First Nations people in this place, would not want to do. The Australian Greens remain committed to the full implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart: truth, treaty, voice. The referendum is the first important step, and I continue to push the government for the establishment of the Makarrata Commission to oversee that truth-telling and treaty-making. My message to all Australians is on referendum day, I will in fact be voting yes to unite Australia and bringing us together for what I see to be a decade of change.
Senator Nampijinka-Price.
Thank you, Madam President. Today, this parliament will pass the legislation to give Australians their say on Labor's voice. As I travel around the country, I'm constantly asked questions by the people of Australia, wanting to understand the voice, wanting to know how it will work, wanting to know what tangible difference it will make. These are reasonable questions that deserve answers. On Friday night and into the early hours of Saturday morning, Senator Cash, Senator Little, myself and others put those questions to the government. And no surprise, they couldn't answer them. To answer one, the minister would point to Labor's design principles as explanation of how the voice would work. To answer another, the minister would dodge questions by saying all specifics would be up to the parliament. But it can't be both. This government is simultaneously claiming their design principles are the detail Australians are asking for, while also confirming that nothing can be guaranteed until after the referendum. Labor's voice has received criticism from across the spectrum for the proposed wording as flawed and risky, with some warning it will open a legal can of worms. Some of this country's top legal experts can't agree on how the constitutional change may be interpreted. But what we do know is that the wording of this proposal gives Labor's voice a near unlimited scope. When one constitutional law professor warned the voice may have input on matters, quote, from submarines to parking tickets, his concerns were mocked in this parliament. The Prime Minister may mock these concerns, but the reality is he cannot guarantee that the voice won't input on these matters. The Prime Minister wants us to blindly trust him, to sign his blank cheque and allow his risky proposal to be enshrined forever in the Constitution when he cannot guarantee anything. Labor showed us on Friday night that they cannot define what matters relate specifically to Indigenous Australians that don't affect non-Indigenous Australians. They showed us that they could not say what makes Indigenous Australians different to other Australians. When asked if Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are Australians, one Labor minister even had to confer with his advisors, and he still couldn't give an answer. While all of this is important, I ask Australians to look at the root of this proposal and ask themselves if they truly believe that this is the answer. Will an extra layer of bureaucracy and red tape do anything more to help Indigenous Australians? Will a Canberra body of academics and experts do anything more to close the gap? Will a body made for one group of Australians to the exclusion of all others bring us closer together? I understand Australians want to do everything they can to help Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in need. I have seen this empathy and goodwill time and time again, but I also have seen it exploited, and I'm seeing it exploited now. The goodwill of many non-Indigenous Australians is being exploited by those who seek to profit in money, clout or power off the real problems being faced by marginalised Australians. This is a dangerous and costly proposal. It is legally risky and full of unknowns. It is exploitative. It is emotionally manipulative. But worst of all, from the day Mr Albanese put his wording to the Australian people, the process of division was begun. We are being divided. We will be further divided throughout this campaign. And if the yes vote is successful, we will be divided forever. I want to see Australia move forward as one, not two divided. That's why I will be voting no.
Thank you, Senator Price. Senator Thorpe, I'm going to give the call to Senator Pocock and invite you to go and put a jacket over your T-shirt. Slogans are not allowed in the chamber. Thank you. Senator Pocock.
Thank you, President. I appreciate the opportunity just to briefly correct the record on a few things. In the early hours of Saturday morning, we heard much about the need to have a respectful conversation, for it to be grounded in fact, and there were just a few things that I think have been said this morning that are already bordering on misinformation, if not well into that territory. Senator Cash asserted that Australians have an equal say in this referendum. I would like to point out that Australians who live in the territories only count for half. We only count for the total national vote. You don't actually look at the territories' votes. The other assertion was that this is adding race to the Constitution. Race is already in the Constitution. This is about ensuring that First Nations people, Australia's first peoples, have a say on issues that affect them. And after 10 years where we've seen things not improve, it makes no sense to hear arguments to say, well, we shouldn't change anything. Yes, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. But if it's broken, it requires fixing. and this is an opportunity to fix it. Senator Nampijinpa Price referred to this as Labor's voice and the Canberra voice. That is blatantly untrue. This is the result of one of the most consultative processes in Australia's history.
Order.
The Uluru Statement from the Heart was presented to the former government in 2017. It is a generous offer of a way for us to truly move forward, to address the entrenched disadvantage that we talk about so much here in the Senate chamber. I would like to acknowledge Auntie Pat Anderson and Professor Megan Davis and the many others here who have been working for decades to get to this moment. Working for decades to get Australia to the point where we are willing to make meaningful structural change to the way that we do things when it comes to First Nations people. And we have an incredible opportunity as a nation. My hope is that as senators, we will all keep things grounded in fact when it comes to campaigning, regardless of our differing views on this.
Thank you, Senator Pocock. Order. Just a moment, Senator Thorpe. I'm going to call you in a minute if you would resume your seats. It's not appropriate that there is clapping or any other actions from anyone in the gallery. Senator Thorpe.
Thank you, President. Well, happy Assimilation Day. Sovereignty has never been ceded, but for the first time in this country's history, people are starting to talk about sovereignty and what that actually means. To recognise First Peoples' sovereignty in this country will dissolve this colonial, violent institution that we're all in right now. That's why you won't acknowledge sovereignty in the racist Australian Constitution. That's why the Greens voted it down, and the hypocrisy of climate. This is a colonial institution with colonial laws. I'm here, yes, I'm here to infiltrate it, to rattle the cages, to destroy the white supremacy that is represented in this place.
Senator Thorpe, I remind you to make your comments to the President. Thank you.
I am here for 5 more years. I don't need no one's vote. I don't need anyone's white guilt. And that's what this is about. It's appeasing the white guilt in this country by giving the poor little blackfellas a powerless advisory body where the Parliament, this place, and have a look at it, they decide what it is, who it is. It might be one person. A body doesn't mean a group of people. Could be Noel Pearson. Could be one of them fellas up there, poster boy himself. Well, poster boy also followed me around the meeting at Uluru. Oh, it's terrible, isn't it? But you won't talk to the Black Sovereign Movement about these issues. You've denied their space at the table to tell you what really happened over those 2 days at Yulara. The violence, the intimidation, the bullying. What about the referendum meetings? What happened at those? We had an old man, one arm, lit a fire in protest at Blacktown in Sydney, at the Sydney Dialogue. One arm he had. He lit a fire with his grandkids to protest. What happened to him? Fire brigade came, put his fire out. Remember that? You remember that? They put his fire out and they arrested him and they put him in the back of the divvy wagon outside that dialogue. I had the chair of the Referendum Council throw the microphone across the table at me at the Melbourne dialogue. Let's talk about that. 100 people in the room, they all witnessed it. You remember that? That's the bullying and intimidation and threats that have gone on for 6 years. 6 years they've denied the black sovereign movement. Megan Davis said it already in her speech. We excluded black leaders because they were cynical. So they even admitted to not having real black grassroots leaders at the table. They had the numbers sewn up in those dialogues. They had it sewn up. They had all the land councils and the organisations. They did the numbers. They said, right, no, we got it. It's going to happen. And what do you know? Here we are today. And yeah, I wore my gammon T-shirt.
Senator Thorpe, please resume your seat. I asked you respectfully, in fact, I ordered you to cover your shirt because any slogans that can be read by me are inappropriate. So please don't also then refer to it. Please continue.
Thank you, President. Gammon, as we know, is fake, pretend, a joke. And that's what I think a powerless voice is to this place. We have fought over 200 years against colonisation. The Constitution is an illegal document. It's illegal. The occupation in this country is illegal. You're following the king. The king. We're all bound by the king. And now the poor little blackfellas are begging for a seat at the table and all we get is to become advisors with no power. Well, I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed that we're not standing here for a treaty or for some truth to happen in this country and that we've followed a Conservative regime, John Howard's regime, Labor. His position and the King's position is to wipe us out. We're a problem. We're certainly a problem to this mob. We're just a problem that needs to be fixed all the time. And you're just tinkering around the edges. You won't implement the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. You've had ample time to do that in the last 32 years. You've had ample time to implement the recommendations to the stolen generations. Like, you are completely gammon, fake. You're not genuine. You wave your flag and wear your deadly black earrings and feel real good about it, and we're hearing all these beautiful, heartfelt stories about how this is going to fix our lives. It's going to solve everything. We can't even do anything until after this referendum. Everything is in estimates. Oh, wait till the referendum, wait till the referendum. Meanwhile, our children are being tortured in prisons. Our babies are being stolen from their mothers' arms. Our people are taking their lives. Young men are telling me about the hanging points in their cells. They're passing the word around because they've had enough. And what does the Labor government do about that? Oh, it's state and territory responsibility. We're washing our hands from this. But there are federal responsibilities that you also ignore. The Black Sovereign Movement is a voice that you never allowed at the table. If that is anything to go by, then your tokenistic voice, what hope has that got? Who's going to listen to a token voice? You, just you. Do you want the voice to tell you that you need to stop killing our people? Do you want the voice? I hope the voice is going to tell this parliament that they've got to stop killing our people. They've got to stop the suicides. They've got to stop assimilating us into their system. We have the oldest constitution on the planet. First peoples in this country. Why are we begging like paupers again to go in to a white, racist, colonial constitution that was set up to deny everything that we are, to destroy our lands and our waters, to destroy everything as quickly as they could, to extract as much resource from stolen land, to dispossess us and make a nice life for yourselves. There is not one law in this country that has ever been good for us. Not one. And now we're meant to accept a powerless voice. It is truly assimilating our people so we fit nicely as your little Indigenous Australians. It's what you want us to be, right? You don't want us to speak our language. You don't want us to practice our culture. Only when you go to some festival and feel good about it. It's the only time you want to look at our culture, when it suits you, when you want to hang a painting in your Senate office. Doesn't back up what you're actually doing. You are crucifying us again, giving us no power. If you were genuine, give us Senate seats in here, like they do in New Zealand. Have a treaty, like they do. Why can't we do that? What are you scared of, Labor? Hawke got sidelined by his Conservatives at the time and told not to pursue treaty. You know that. Keating tried. He got shut down. And Albo's obviously got no guts to even go there.
Senator Thorpe, I remind you to refer to others in the other place by their proper titles.
Well, the Prime Minister of this country, the Labor Prime Minister, has not even got the courage to come out and say that he wants a treaty. He's going straight for constitutional recognition to put us in there so we're nice, good little Aborigines with the Parliament's supremacy over us at all times. Well, well done. Well done on the assimilation agenda. You had the Greens backing, which is why I left. This is a point in this country where it's a final nail in the coffin. And I'll be voting no to this disastrous idea of giving us no power. If this bill gave us power, then I would have thought about supporting that. But I can't support something that gives my people no power. I can't support something that is handpicked by whomever is in power. I can't support something that is just going to be considered as not very important in this place. We know how we operate in this place. It's hard enough to find time for a meeting. Who's going to have time to listen to the voice opinion? You don't have to turn up to get the advice. It's just advice. And as a previous advisor to ministerial groups and women's ministerial advisory bodies, I've done all of that. You're just a token advisor. So happy Assimilation Day, everybody. Many clans and nations around this country do not support assimilating into such a racist colonial regime, and we'll continue to push for our sovereignty to be acknowledged. We'll continue to push for a treaty, and we'll continue to push for peace, real peace in this country. Not the peace that you've seen over the last 6 years of this campaign and bullying, which has really divided so many families and communities. We're not going away. We have survived. We have survived massacre, murders over the last 230 years, and will continue to survive. And we will never cede our sovereignty. It's not just a word, it's an action, Greens. We will never cede our sovereignty, and we'll fight you to the end for a treaty so that we have real power in this country. So look out.
Thank you, Senator Thorpe. Senator Hanson.
Thank you very much. This will be probably one of the most momentous days in the history of our nation and this parliament. We are looking at passing a piece of legislation that will enable the people of this nation to go to a referendum on a voice to Parliament. As I've travelled around the country and spoken to a lot of Australians, they are still very, very confused about what this means to them and future generations. Some of the speakers today in this chamber, I cannot and will not agree with them. But as I look around the chamber and the people in the galleries, I see people of all different cultural backgrounds, all different races, people that have migrated to this country for a better way of life. This nation was founded on the Westminster system of government after it was settled by the English. Yes, we all acknowledge there were other people at the time in this nation. But it's been on the backbone of the, as people say, the colonialists, the convicts, the people who came here. Many came here, dragged here from England and other places against their will. They were the stolen generation as well. Many atrocities have happened over the period of time, and we have not acknowledged that. We can't change it, but we have acknowledged it. Our country has grown with a parliamentary system that was started, the same system in England, with a parliament, with people elected based on their dedication, passion, those people wanting to make changes for the betterment of this country. Those opportunities have been afforded to anyone, whether it be people born here, migrants, refugees, and even the Indigenous Australian. To say that they've never had a voice is truly untrue. It's not the truth. We have Indigenous people sitting in this parliament, based on their ability and their dedication, hold their seats in this place with pride, representing not only their own cultural background and trying to represent them, but for all Australians. The same as I do. My cultural background may be of English-Irish, but my responsibility in this place is to all Australians, regardless of race, colour, creed. To raise issues, as Senator Pocock has, and saying a lot of these questions haven't been answered, you know, you've got problems out there. You know, this comes from a senator that on many occasions to do with legislation hasn't consulted with the people, hasn't consulted with businesses, has just supported legislation. And yet he dares to question the fact that there was consultation that went on. It never did. At Uluru, it never did. It was a bunch of academics that went out there. The Aboriginals that I have visited in some of these communities haven't even been consulted. They have no idea what's going on. And I'm sure Senator Price will back me up with this. You know, when we talk about the problems, billions and billions of dollars have been thrown at it over the years. I've spoken about it since I first came to Parliament in 1996. The money has not got to where it has needed to go. You've had your bodies, you've got over 3,200 Aboriginal corporations and bodies. You've got a department that's set up under the previous government, the NIAA, $4.5 billion a year. You handed out over $1 billion in grants in 1 year to 1,500. You got another, all the other government departments handing out $11.5 billion in grants. Where has the money gone? That's the question you need to ask yourselves. Where has the money gone? Who have you put in charge of it? Is the fox in charge of the hen house? And yet you turn around and you want to blame everyone else who is not Aboriginal Indigenous in this nation for the faults that maybe you should look in your own backyard and question yourselves. Why hasn't things changed? You know, you talk about the stolen generation. Yes, it did happen at the time. Ask yourself why. A lot of these children would not have survived if they were not taken away from their families. And that's the truth of the matter. And some Indigenous have even admitted that. We don't do it these days, but some of the children should because of the sexual abuse that is happening to them. But we turn a blind eye to it. We keep putting them back to families that are not going to protect and look after those children. But we don't do it to non-Indigenous families. We take the children away. Is that right for the children? How many of you in this chamber have actually been to these Aboriginal communities? Have actually seen what is happening? You know, children on the streets in the middle of the night, children in fear to going home to their homes because of the abuse, the alcohol and drug abuse, the sexual abuse. These are young children. Why is it my fault because I'm white? Why is it not the community's fault? Why are we turning a blind eye to this? These are the problems that we really need to ask a question. Do you think a voice to Parliament is going to change all this? And Senator Thorpe was right. They want Senate seats in this place purely allocated to the Indigenous. Why? Even Senator Farrell asked me a couple of years ago, would I support an increase of 14 senators per state? No, I wouldn't. We're overrepresented in this place. We don't need more senators. We need people with vision for the future of this nation. That's what we need, not more members of Parliament pushing your own agendas. This is not bringing us together. This voice to Parliament is going to be divisive. We are all Australians together. No one's taken into consideration my place in all this, or any other Australian that's been born here who's not Indigenous. Do you really care about the fact that I'm part of this land? Just because you can say that you got a connection with this land for 65,000 years, I don't care. All I've heard it raised from 40,000, 50,000, 60,000, 65,000, and I've even heard 100,000. Just because you got your cave paintings and your dream time and you have this connection with the land, what about my connection with this land? What about the farmers? What about the people who work the land? What about the defence personnel? What about the people who've died, sacrificing their lives for our freedom and for this nation? Every person who would put their life down to protect our country from freedom, for freedom, they have every right to this land. To say that you have a connection to the land, to the waters, to the environment. I actually went up to Palm Island. I remember the conversation with the Aboriginals up there who asked for my assistance, which I did all that I possibly can to help them with their hospital issue, the education, the housing. Disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful. And if you remember my interview, Charlie Perkins was there. And he said, you have no idea the connection that we have with the land. And I said, if you've got that much of a connection, why don't you clean it up? And this is, there's more to it than that. It's about the fact we are all Australians. We cannot change what has happened in this nation. We cannot turn back the hands of time. We acknowledge what's happened. But to think that you can actually give people authority, voices to Parliament, and it's going to make things better? It's people who have the intestinal fortitude to call it out for what it is. It's people who will fight against those being called a racist because you dare challenge anything. The word racist means nothing these days. It's about being a member of Parliament to represent all Australians. And I come to the point where we're being lied to. Even Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, who's in the chamber today, he said the voice of Parliament could be challenged. In the High Court, there's no guarantees. And then you have here, in the Australian front page of the paper, it says Indigenous voice to Parliament, yes, campaigner Thomas Mayo's radical vision. As he says here, threatened that politicians would be punished if they ignored the voice advisory body. Went on to say the voice of Parliament being the first step towards reparations and compensation for Indigenous Australians. More money, more greed, more power, more control. And then it says, the voice, the power of the voice was its ability to punish politicians that ignore our advice on legislation and funding. Is this your truth-telling? Is this what you mean? So someone who's been caught on videotape saying this? Or the fact is, we are going to use the rule book of the nation to force them. And what I've already spoken about, and as Senator Thorpe has said, is to pay the rent, for example. How do we do that in a way that is transparent and that actually sees reparations and compensation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people beyond what we say and do at a rally? And also, it is a way to further what we need for our people in any negotiations for treaties and for other things like legislation, reform and abolishment of the old colonial institutions. What's that mean? Reform and abolishment of the old colonial institutions. You see, that's why I said in my opening statement, there is so much confusion, so many lies. You haven't been upfront with the people. You haven't declared exactly what you're intending. And as I've said and I'll tell the people, my views is that I believe that you intend to form a state within the country, a black state in this nation. And you intend to actually allocate seats in Parliament to the Indigenous. See, all you're doing is put the wording into the Constitution and you are going to make the legislation yourself. As I think it was Minister Watt said on the floor here one time, He said, we will actually have the voice in the Constitution, and then we will actually draft the legislation to suit. And that's what the Australian people must consider. You have no idea what their intentions are because they're not being truthful with you. You need to know the truth. Everyone needs to know the truth. And I call on those Indigenous Australians to actually consider this hatred that's been peddled, this racism over a period of time, that has to stop. When you have a senator in this place that gets out and says, this is war, that's why the confusion with our youth, the crimes that are committed, what happens on the streets in Alice Springs was disgraceful, in Townsville and other places around this country. It's about us all working together to find the answers to it. The voice to Parliament's not it. You've got the voice. You've got a big voice now as it is. You've got more representation in this Parliament per the numbers of Indigenous who claim to be Indigenous. And that's another thing. You haven't even got the guts to even admit that there is identity fraud in this nation. You've knocked back my bill. You have knocked back our Senate inquiry into it. Why? When you have people jumping on bandwagon claiming Aboriginality, you say there's going to be 24 elected representatives. Who are they? Are you going to have Bruce Pascoe? Who are you going to have on it? Lydia Thorpe? Senator Thorpe? Who are you going to have on it? Can you just imagine that? Who is going to be your voice to Parliament? Are they truly going to be Indigenous? Or is that you other people, the right to actually have a voice and really don't want it? So be truthful with the Australian people. And I'd be surprised, you've been very disciplined, Labor. You've held your people back. You can't tell me each and every one of you agrees with this voice, but you'll have your say at the ballot box, as everyone will.
Order.
So it's... To the people of Australia, we are one people, one nation, and should be under one flag. And I am telling the people of this nation, vote no to this piece of legislation and the referendum.
Thank you, Senator Thorpe. Senator McCarthy.
Here we go. Thank you, President. And I thank all those who've attended this morning in the gallery, and in particular our young people up there. This is an incredibly significant day in the history of our country and the Parliament in terms of the final debate on the Constitution Alteration Bill. And we have heard from senators over the last week as well as today in terms of their views on the Constitution Alteration Bill. We've certainly heard from the lower house as well, from all members who've spoken there. And it has been done, if I may say so to the President, in a very dignified way here in the Senate. And I am incredibly grateful for that, President, that senators have been able to conduct themselves despite the different views, and there are many, and despite the deep passion, and obviously for some the concerns that they raise that give them a great deal of worry about what the future looks like. But can I just stand here not only as a senator for the Northern Territory, but also as a Yanyuwagarawa woman, a First Nations woman from Borroloola in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and say how incredibly proud I am, President, to be able to stand and speak for the voice and the importance of being able to go to a referendum and say yes for our country, yes for a better future, yes for First Nations people to be able to make decisions in terms of advising the Parliament and the Executive as to decisions made about them so they can have input into that. It is a very simple request, President, to be recognised in the Australian Constitution. And yes, there are many schools of thought in terms of that Constitution, but in terms of the symbolic nature of being able to be included in that Constitution means a great deal to many First Nations people. In fact, this whole debate we have seen with research polling across the country that majority of First Nations people want this to happen, President. They want this to happen. They are reaching out to all Australians to be able to feel proud of this time in our country's history where we can lift one another up,
where First Nations people can be and feel very much a part of the complete fabric. It is the systemic change that was called upon by those who gathered at Uluru on Anangu country, the systemic change within the Westminster system of Parliament, of governance, that we all live under, whether we like it or not. It is the system we live under. And that has been the very simple request by all of those First Nations people who came together through all the dialogues and came together on Anangu country 6 years ago. But this journey, President, began long before that. It has gone on for decades. And I take this moment to remember Senator Pat Dodson. Senator Pat Dodson, who led us through the reconciliation process and who is here with us in spirit today, all the way from Broome in his home country. And we think of you, Pat, because it was you who has given us, certainly on this side, and I know with my colleagues, First Nations colleagues, Linda Burney, Marion Scrimger, Senator Jana Stewart, and also Gordon, who I know is with us as well. It's important, President, that we are able to pursue this as a country in dignity, with respect for one another. Yes, we have our differences, but isn't that what a referendum is about? Isn't the referendum an opportunity for Australians to be able to reach out to us as parliamentarians and say yes or no to what it is that we take to them? And I do thank the senators in advance who will be supporting this bill, despite your personal opposition to it. It is important that we send a message across the country that this referendum matters and that it should be conducted with the most dignity. And we should show not only to each other, but to our global family around the world that First Nations people do matter in this country. And that First Nations people's voices are being heard throughout this process. But I am concerned a little bit when I hear about some of the commentary that goes on, and I still urge all Australians to dig deep, to listen to the better side of yourself throughout this debate and to keep it at a level that is respectful. I am mindful when we reflect on the marriage equality debate and the hurt, the deep hurt that impacted a lot of those families throughout that whole debate. And I ask all Australians to ensure that we keep our discussions and debate, our considerations as we walk this journey, this very sacred journey of our country, with the utmost respect for one another. And that means all sides. All of us on the yes side, I urge you to be mindful of the commentary and the conversations that we have with the broader Australian public. All those on the no side, I ask you to do the same. It is only then can we find the better part of ourselves as a country, President, the better part of ourselves as Australians, as all Australians. But this is a critical moment in our country's history. It is the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do, President. And it is time now to put this question to the Australian people.
Thank you, Senator McCarthy. Minister Watt.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Senator McCarthy, for the rewarding...
You are watching ABC News. Welcome to Parliament there. The Senate's debating the Indigenous voice to Parliament. They will vote after they have all had their say on how they feel it should be approached. Let's bring in our Indigenous voice correspondent, Dan Borscher. Hi there, Dan. Some lengthy statements and really getting the cross-section of how senators feel about this. What stuck out for you?
Yeah, Lorna, good morning. Well, we've certainly heard a wide range of views there. I want to begin at the end with Malandiri McCarthy, a Yanyuwa Ngajua woman from Borroloola in the Northern Territory, who spoke about this being the time for change and also calling there for great sensitivity in how we have this conversation. And also they're really explaining from the yes side and the government's perspective of what this is all about. And of course, we know that there's been extensive debate, Lorna, in the recent weeks to get to this point. In fact, the Senate sat into the very early hours of Saturday morning in order for members of the upper house, the senators, to have their say and to outline their position on this. Before that, of course, we heard from Senator Pauline Hanson, who was really very clearly articulating her position of being no. And I guess if I can offer a little analysis on some of the points that Senator Hanson made, particularly where she was speaking to the stolen generation and saying that many of those people that were taken, quote, a lot of these children would not have survived if they weren't taken away. We know from the 1997 Bringing Them Home report that that is just not true. We've heard the testimony from members of the stolen generation about the way they were treated. In fact, I was sitting on country at Cootamundra just a couple of weeks ago with an elder auntie, Faye Clayton-Mosley, who held my hand as her eyes filled with tears, and she explained to me what it was like to be taken away from her father and mother, her father who was a rat of Tobruk and was seen as a respected member of the community. The day that she was taken along with her siblings, Lorna, she explained that they told her she was going on a holiday. Once they got her in the bus, they said that her parents didn't love her. This is incredibly challenging, and that sort of language will really hit home to members of the stolen generation who were watching that this morning, particularly after we had just earlier this year the anniversary of the apology to members of the stolen generation. And I think that it goes to the big conversation so many people have been having about how we have this conversation. When Auntie Faye told me that no one in the time that she was at the Cootamundra home said that they loved her, really hit a chord. And of course, this is part of the big conversation that we're having right now. She was certainly calling there for us to all be listening, and that's really what we've been hearing this morning. So many different perspectives from so many different politicians across the political spectrum. Lydia Thorpe saying there for the first time that she'll be voting no for this, that she was again pushing for there to be very much a sovereign debate, Lorna. And that there, of course, we also heard from Dorinda Cox from the Greens explaining that sovereignty was never ceded and that this is seen as a next step, right through to Jacinta Napajimpa Price, a member of the Conservative side of politics, the Country Liberal Party, who's the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, saying that she was worried about how another bureaucracy would work and would it in fact have the impact of having outcomes on the ground for the most disadvantaged in Australia. She says no, right through to what we heard from the opposition leader in the Senate, Michaelia Cash, who said that this is risky, unknown, divisive and would be permanent, as she detailed her concerns, particularly around the process of that inquiry that was held into the wording that passed just a couple of weeks ago.
And Senator Pocock said, Dan, you know, he wanted to see respectful debate. The conversation should be civil. And that's always going to be the danger over the next 2 or up to 6 months before a referendum happens, how it maintains that respectful level.
Yeah, well, that's certainly something that we've heard put to David Littleproud, the leader of the Nationals, on Radio National this morning. It's a concern that we've heard iterated throughout Senate estimates in recent weeks. The head of the Electoral Commission saying there'd been that increase in the types of derogatory language. Our chief spy saying that there was essentially a risk that there might be violence. There is a very real risk here around this debate, particularly around some of the language that we're seeing. Senator Pocock made that point, as did Senator McCarthy just a few moments ago. And it's certainly one that we've heard from campaigners publicly, and also that they're telling me privately on all sides of this debate that they're very concerned about the tone of this debate and the way that people are being treated and the way that in some instances stories are being weaponised and people feel like they're being targeted for whatever their view might be, regardless of that being yes or no. I'm hearing a whole range of views about that very point.
The statements are continuing in the Senate, as they will for a while. What is the timescale of what's happening there over the next few hours?
Well, we understand, Lorna, that there is not a list of speakers, that at this stage, when senators stand up, that they're being invited to speak. So that will go, we expect, until there are no more senators who want to speak on this. We know that there are going to be lots of conversations after this, that there are more than 15 members of the Uluru Dialogue sitting in the chamber, or just outside of the chamber in the gallery. We also know that they're likely to be speaking to the media later on today. There were also a number of politicians from the lower house that were in the chamber, including Linda Burney, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Mark Dreyfus, the Attorney General, among others, including Dr Gordon Reid and Marion Scrimgeour, Indigenous members of the lower house as well. So we are really, at this stage, listening to what each of those senators has to say, and once they have all spoken, or as many as want to speak today, that's when we're expecting a vote, which is very much expected to happen today.
All right, Dan, we will, of course, keep across it. As you say, those statements will go on for some time, but I know you'll come back to us as soon as there's any movement and we look like some sort of resolution to that debate.
Thank you.